So before we get going, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping because this is our very first Zoom colloquium for the department. So before I welcome Tom and let the colloquium begin, I just want to do three very quick things. The first thing I want to do is just do a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to acknowledge that the UBC Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And at a time like this, where we're all joining from many different places, from near and far, I encourage you and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of the lands that all of you are on as well. Before introducing Tom, I just want to say one more very quick thing about the format for today's talk. So what's going to happen is once Tom begins, he is going to do his talk completely normally. And then afterwards, we're going to have a Q&A session. There are two ways in which you can ask questions of Tom. You could either type questions into what's known as your Q&A panel, and other people can choose to also like upvote questions or things like that. The alternative is that once we begin the Q&A period, you can, in the participants view, raise your hand, and I'll be moderating the Q&A, so I'll be calling on people as they raise their hand. If you raise your hand, we will allow you to go ahead and turn on your mic. That's the only way that I need to authorize that before you can do it. And at that point, you can come on and ask a question in a completely normal way. And so if you do end up having questions during the talk, you can also raise your hand. I'll be monitoring that. Tom doesn't need to, but for simplicity, unless there's something pretty urgent, we think that it would work better if we wait for the Q&A period at the very end, just in order to help with everything. So with that out of the way, I'm gonna do a very quick introduction for Tom and then turn it over to him. So Tom Griffiths is a professor of psychology and cognitive science at Princeton University. He's been at Princeton since 2008. Before that, as some of you may know, he was at Berkeley. He got his PhD from Stanford University in 2005. Tom's research really focuses on computational modeling of cognition, and Tom is really one of the forefront leaders of Bayesian computational modeling of cognition and development. And one of the things that I really love about Tom's work is that Tom takes seriously the idea that Bayesian modeling and Bayesian reasoning can not only be a useful tool in our theorizing about cognition, but also might be a kind of thing that our minds and brains actually find ways of implementing in various kinds of ways in reality as well. Tom has received an incredible number of awards. He's received the Career Award from NSF, the William Estes Early Career Award from the Society for Mathematical Psychology, the Jan Taylor Spence Award for Transformative Early Career Contributions from the APS. His work is constantly and consistently funded by the National Science Foundation, by the John Templeton Foundation, by other places like DARPA as well. He has over 300 articles and chapters published. I feel like Tom's one of those researchers who literally publishes in PNAS every single year. But besides that, of course, in other places like science, psych science, but also very often in very deep theoretical work in places like BBS and TICS as well. Tom's also the author of a more broadly accessible book called Algorithms to Live By, which was nominated as one of the best science books of 2016. And if I can just say a little bit more to you about Tom's research, I think that a lot of us, and I definitely count myself as part of this, we talk a big game about our interdisciplinarity, right? But Tom, to me, is really the sort of the prototype researcher for somebody who cares about issues in psychology across the entire spectrum. Tom's work on Bayesian modeling interfaces on issues in cognition, decision-making, memory, a lot of which you'll hear about today, but also on development, on language acquisition. Tom's work has even shown a lot of interesting things about the use of Bayesian models in things like decoding neural pathways in various brain regions, theory of mind, curiosity, intuitive theories, the very concept of representations. And so, one of the things that I want to say is that with Tom, I always feel like, if you have an interesting question in your own field, you can ask Tom, and he will undoubtedly have something interesting and amazing to say about it as well. And so I think that, you know, he's really an example that I like to use for my own students as well when we're talking about somebody who's a true interdisciplinary thinker. So with that out of the way, I'll turn it over to Tom, who's going to tell us today about modeling cognitive processes as the rational use of limited resources. So, you know, silently, but join me in welcoming Tom. So.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I'm really you know, pleased to be here. I would be even more pleased to actually physically be there, but I'm excited to have the chance to talk to you and interact with you in this virtual environment. So one thing that Dr. just mentioned is that I'm somebody who lives in two different worlds. So I live in the world of psychology, but also in the world of computer science. And living in those different worlds really offers me some different kinds of perspectives on human minds. If you spend a lot of time hanging out with psychologists, one of the impressions that you can walk away with is that humans are a little embarrassing. So in particular, if you talk to psychologists who study how people make decisions or how we reason, you know, here, as represented by the titles of these books, you find out that people are predictably irrational or are ruled by mistakes of reason or are, you know, fundamentally fallible, or whose minds are sort of constructed out of a set of kludges. But if you spend a lot of time hanging out with computer scientists, you get a different kind of impression, which is that, you know, in other ways, humans are inspiring. So this is just one example of an AI system which was built to try and achieve a human capacity, that is being able to, you know, win a game of chess. Here are the games between Deep Blue and Garry Kasparov. And so, you know, what really motivated the artificial intelligence researchers here was building a system that would be able to do something like the kinds of things that human minds are capable of. And a lot of people in artificial intelligence think about trying to solve problems for which humans are still the best examples we have of systems that are capable of solving those problems. This particular game was held up as something which was a victory for the AI system. But I think if you want to get a little bit more inspired by human cognition, it's worth recognizing that these two systems are operating with very different kinds of resources. So, you know, the system on the right is able to search over 100,000 positions a second. The system on the left is maybe, you know, able to search between 1 and 10 positions per second. The system on the right is powered by an industrial power plant. The system on the left is powered by some toast and some coffee, right? So, you know, humans are inspiring in the ways in which we're able to use our computational resources to solve not just problems like chess, but the wide range of things that we do. And that's something which we're still trying to emulate in artificial intelligence systems. So in some ways, this kind of sets up a paradox. How is it that we can be both embarrassing and inspiring? And it's that paradox that I'm going to be talking about today. And I think there's maybe a simple way of understanding what the resolution of that paradox is, which is that there's really kind of two important facts that we need to know about human cognition. First, that humans have limited cognitive resources, something that leads us to make errors when we're trying to do things like make decisions, but that we do a good job of using those resources. And it's the fact that we're so good at allocating the finite resources that we have that makes it possible for us to solve all of the different kinds of problems that we solve as well as we do. And so the resolution of the paradox then is that there's a fundamental way in which we're limited. But, you know, in fact, in part as a consequence of that limitation, there's also a fundamental way in which we're intelligent. And so if you're looking to understand the ways in which people do things wrong, you're going to focus on the consequences of those limitations. But if you're looking to understand the things that people do well, then it's easier to focus on these things that we're capable of doing as a consequence of having to overcome those limitations. So these two ideas are not necessarily, you know, particularly novel ideas. So the first of these in particular, you know, goes back over 50 years to Herb Simon's characterization of human cognition from the perspective of bounded rationality. The second idea, that we're doing a good job of using the resources that we have, I think is something that's shown up a few times, and it's something that we've emphasized in our recent work, what we call resource rational analysis, which focuses on trying to understand how it is that humans are able to do the things that we do by trying to understand what they should be doing given the limited resources that are available to them. And fundamental to this idea is a different way of thinking about what rational behavior looks like. So when we try and come up with a standard for rational decision making, the place that we normally go to is the theory of expected utility maximization. So basically that what we should be doing is taking the action that has the highest expected utility. If you kind of write this as an equation, it's an equation which is maximizing over actions A, the expected utility that results from pursuing those actions. Or if you reduce it to a slogan, the slogan is try and do the right thing. If we are trying to understand human cognition, though, this kind of theory falls short in certain important ways, not least of which is that it doesn't tell you how you figure out what that best action might be. So it kind of defines a criterion for assessing what rational behavior looks like, but it doesn't tell us how it is that as, as computational agents, we might go about computing what those rational courses of action might be. How do we find the action that maximizes expected utility? And it doesn't recognize that in some cases, doing so might be something that's extremely computationally costly. So it's not really a theory of rational action for finite agents, for agents that have finite time or finite computational resources. And those are exactly the factors that I'm emphasizing are an important part of how human cognition works. So if we want a theory of rational action for finite agents, we have to look a little further. There's actually a framework for thinking about this that comes from artificial intelligence research. And this is a framework that's called meta-level rationality, which is using the strategy that trades off utility and computational cost the best. So the idea here is that we think about the agent trying to find a strategy or an algorithm or a program which they're going to use to solve a problem, or a policy is another term that's used. And what we care about is that strategy is something which ends up being a good trade-off between how well it performs and how hard you have to think to follow the strategy. And so again, if we try and write this as an equation, the equation looks a little more complicated. Now, instead of maximizing over actions A, we're going to maximize over these strategies or policies, what I've written here as pi. And we're going to try and find the strategy or policy that allows us to achieve a set of beliefs B, which are going to lead us to take a good action when we take the action that seems like the best action based on the beliefs that are available to us, trading off the utility that we get from taking that action with the computational cost of the sort of cognition that goes into achieving those beliefs. And so if we reduce this to a slogan, then that slogan is something more like doing the right thinking, right? So rather than focusing on the external actions that we take, the focus is on the internal computations that we perform to get us to the point where we're ready to take an action. And then I'm going to refer to this as resource rationality because I think it helps to emphasize the fact that it's really about making rational use of the cognitive resources that are available to you. So if we go from these kinds of mathematical descriptions just to a kind of cartoon picture of the difference between these views, I think this helps to emphasize the fact that these two ways of thinking about what rational behavior looks like put their focus in different places. Expected utility theory is actually kind of a behaviorist theory of rational action. It doesn't care what's going on inside your head. It doesn't say anything about what your internal mental states might be. It's defined entirely in terms of the actions that you end up taking in the external world. And so if you're a cognitive psychologist or cognitive scientist trying to figure out how human minds work, there's not a lot of information that provides for thinking about or trying to understand the underlying cognitive processes. By contrast, this framework of resource rationality is something that puts the emphasis on the sequence of computations that the agent performs in service of choosing a reasonable action to take in the world. And so that sequence of computations is exactly the kind of thing that we're normally interested in as cognitive psychologists. It's the mental states that we engage in, the thoughts and sort of mental processes that we go through in order to get to the point where we think that we're going to be ready to take an action. And so rather than focusing on that external action, we focus on the internal states that get us to the point where we're ready to act. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk today is really kind of use this as a framework for, first of all, trying to reconcile this kind of rational view of, of mental states with a more traditional kind of heuristics and biases perspective on how people do things like making decisions. And then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to emphasize how we can go from evaluating the kinds of heuristics that psychologists have already discovered to deriving new kinds of heuristics and strategies automatically as a consequence of the way that we're formulating these problems. And I'll introduce some mathematical machinery that we can use for doing that I think really provides a different way of thinking about what we're trying to do in cognitive psychology. I should have mentioned at the start, but I'll mention it here. So this is all joint work with Falk Lieder, who's at the Max Planck Institute in Tübingen, who is a graduate student with me and now a group leader at Max Planck, and Fred Calloway, who's currently a graduate student with me. And I'll mention some other people as we go on through the talk as well. Okay, so the first part here is really going to be focusing on looking at the kinds of heuristic strategies that have already been identified by psychologists and then evaluating them with respect to this new kind of criterion of resource rationality. And the basic finding that we have is that when we take into account the cost of computation, some of these classic heuristics are actually things that we can make sense of as being good resource rational strategies. And I'm going to go through two examples of this just to give you a flavor of what these kinds of analyses look like. And these two examples are going to be first, anchoring and adjustment, a kind of classic heuristic, going back to Kahneman and Tversky, this phenomenon that people tend to fixate on particular numbers and then fail to fully adjust their estimates away from that. And the second is the availability of extreme events, again, something that has its roots in Kahneman and Tversky's work, where people tend to overestimate the probability of extreme outcomes. And I'm going to show you how we can make sense of both of these as, in fact, good strategies for dealing with certain kinds of computational constraints that we might operate under. So for the first of these phenomena, anchoring and adjustment, I'm going to do a little demo so we can see how this works. This is going to be my attempt to do a live Zoom demo. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'm assuming that you have access to the chat. Darko, is that going to work?
Yes, people should have access to the chat.
Okay, so I'd like you to think about it for a moment and then just type your answer into the chat. And normally I do this in a relatively anonymous fashion, but we can't really do that easily here. But I think you shouldn't be embarrassed. These are questions that you shouldn't necessarily know the answer to. Okay, so the first question is, what is the freezing point of vodka in degrees Fahrenheit? You can think about it and start making some estimates. Okay, great. I think we're converging. Okay. And then the second question is, how long is Mars's orbit around the sun expressed in Earth days? I'm just looking at some of the answers here. Okay. All right. So these are actually questions that were asked in a study by Epley and Gilovich. And what they found was that people tend to overestimate the freezing point of vodka. That is, they give a number which is higher than its actual freezing point. So its freezing point is negative 17 degrees Fahrenheit. You can evaluate yourself on whether you overestimated that or not. And people tend to underestimate the duration of Mars's orbit around the sun. So the actual answer is 687 days. And most people give a number which is smaller than that. And it's easy to understand why people might be making those particular errors, right? So if you start with a more familiar example, like the freezing point of water or the duration of Earth's orbit around the sun, and then adjust away from it, but sort of don't adjust fully, then you might end up with something which is a biased response to this question. And so this is the phenomenon that we'd like to set out to understand. So if we try and think about this from the perspective of this kind of resource rational approach, then the three things that we need to define in order to do that are the task that people are performing, the sort of problem that's being solved, the computational architecture that's being used for solving that problem, and then the computational cost that's involved with executing those computations. And here the task is we're trying to estimate a quantity based on your memory and maybe some other cues that you might be trying to integrate. And we're going to treat that basically as a problem of Bayesian inference. So what you're doing is trying to compute a posterior distribution over the possible values that it could be based on all of the pieces of information that you have. Then we have to specify an architecture that you could use for doing that. The one that I'm going to assume is something called a Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm. It's called the Metropolis-Hastings algorithm. In fact, it doesn't really matter what choice we're making here across a fairly broad class of algorithms, but the property of this algorithm that's relevant is that it's an iterative adjustment algorithm. So at every point, you're going to be producing an estimate by updating the value of the previous estimate. And I'll show you how this works in this particular algorithm, and I'll explain what the property is that's the relevant property. And then finally, we have to assume something about the computational cost. And I'm going to assume that the cost is going to increase linearly in the number of samples that we take, the number of iterations of this updating procedure that we perform. And that's appropriate for if you just think about these as units of cognitive costs somehow, or also if you think about these as opportunity costs in terms of, you could have been doing something better with the time that you were spending thinking about my question. Okay, so this particular algorithm, the Metropolis-Hastings algorithm, is an algorithm for sampling from a probability distribution. And the way that it works is that you start out with an initial estimate. That's what's being shown here at the bottom. Some initial estimates you could have of a quantity. So here, the quantity you're trying to estimate is this, the answer to one of these questions. And then you make a proposal. That's what this distribution Q shows, is this is a distribution around your current value, and you sort of propose some variation on your current value. And then you make a decision about whether that proposed value is better or not. And the way that you do that is by taking into account the distribution you're trying to converge to. So if it's something which seems closer, has higher posterior probability, then you're more likely to accept that proposal. And you iterate this process again and again. And the kind of magic of these algorithms is that if you do that enough, it converges to the actual distribution that you're sampling from. So what I'm showing here, these lines show the path of a sequence of estimates when we start from the 3 points in the bottom. And at some point, those paths cross over, meaning that we've converged, the distribution of those estimates has converged to something. And then when we actually just sum up all of the values across all of those paths, it ends up producing a histogram that approximates the probability distribution P, which is the one that we're actually using to make these decisions about whether an individual value is better or not. So the key points of this algorithm are, it starts off from some initial value. It iteratively updates, in this case, in a kind of stochastic fashion. And then it sort of, over time, the quality of that estimate gets better. And so you can kind of think about this as our model for this anchoring and adjustment process. The idea is that you have an initial value, right? That's the place where you start on the bottom here. And then you're going to adjust that estimate. And then you're going to, at some, the more adjustment you do, the better it gets. And over time, you're going to converge to the correct value. And so the question that we can ask is, how long should you run this algorithm? How many updates should you do? How much should you adjust your estimates? And the maybe surprising answer is that, in fact, you shouldn't necessarily run it all that long. So one property that this algorithm has, and that a lot of other algorithms, like stochastic gradient descent or other kinds of iterative adjustment algorithms have, is that you get diminishing returns for doing additional iterations of updating those estimates. So what the graph on the left here is showing is the amount of bias you have in your estimate, that is how biased you are towards that initial anchor value that you started out with, as a function of the amount of computation that you do. And the different lines just correspond to starting points that are different distances away from the correct, the mean of the correct distribution. And in all of these cases, what you get is this pattern of like exponential convergence, that initially you converge very quickly, and then there's sort of diminishing returns to doing additional computations. And what that means is that if you have a linearly increasing cost for updating your estimates and an exponentially decreasing benefit for doing those estimates, there's going to be a point where those things are going to cross over, and there's going to be a value which is the value at which you should stop doing your updating. And we can actually compute what that looks like. So that's what the right plot shows. This is, as we vary the cost of doing each iteration to the cost of making an error in the estimate that you produce, then the sort of rational amount of bias, the point at which you should stop, is something which increases, right? Intuitively, as cost increases for doing the computation relative to the benefit that you get for getting the right answer, you should spend less time computing because the benefits of that are diminished. And so this gives us a very simple kind of model of anchoring and adjustment, one that we can actually use to fit quantitative data. So in order to do this, we actually ran a study where we took Epley and Gilovich's stimuli and we estimated all of the quantities that we needed in order to make that algorithm something that's viable. So we actually estimated what does the posterior distribution look like for these quantities? How uncertain are people about them? We got the means of those distributions, we got the information about the starting points, and then we had to fit one parameter to the data, which is how big a step size people are taking when they're making these iterations. But using that information about how uncertain people are about particular quantities and how close the anchors are that people would generate, we can actually do a very good job of predicting the amount that people adjust away from those initial estimates for these kinds of stimuli that are like the ones that I showed you. But also more qualitatively, this gives us a way of understanding a bunch of phenomena that are involved in people using this kind of heuristic. So cognitive load, time pressure, alcohol consumption all reduce adjustment. And those are all things that potentially increase computational cost. So that makes sense. You're increasing the costs involved. And so that should decrease the extent to which you're willing to adjust away from that initial estimate. Incentives can increase it. That's because that's changing the other side of the equation, increasing the cost of making a mistake. Bias increases with anchor extremity in a way that's predicted by our model. Uncertainty increases anchoring in a way that's consistent with the model too, where, as that distribution becomes more spread out, it takes longer to converge towards it. And that knowledge can abolish the anchoring bias because that's making that distribution tighter. And so these are all phenomena that fall out of just thinking about this as a kind of a rational trade-off in the amount of computation you're doing to answer a question. The second heuristic I'm going to talk about is the availability heuristic. And so the classic availability bias is that people overestimate the probability of events that come to mind easily. And extreme events are things that come to mind easily. So if you're trying to make a decision about whether you should go snorkeling, what you should be thinking about is this. But what you might be thinking about is this, right? Some very low probability, but very bad outcome that you might be worried about. And so again, if we want to understand this phenomenon in this resource rational way, we need to talk about the kind of task we imagine people doing, the computational architecture that we imagine being used, and the computational cost that's involved in using that architecture. And so here, the idea is that the task that you're trying to do is you're trying to decide, should I do this thing? Should I go snorkeling? And you're trying to evaluate an expected utility against some probability distribution. The underlying architecture is one where we're going to assume that you're able to generate samples from some probability distribution. So you're able to kind of simulate what the possible outcomes of an action might be. And you can then decide how you're going to use those samples. And then computational cost is going to increase linearly in the number of those samples. And so the simplest thing to do, the thing that you might imagine doing if I said to you, okay, I've got some utilities and I've got some probabilities with which they occur, and now you can take some samples from some distribution and then use those to evaluate the average of those utilities. The simple thing to do, what's called simple Monte Carlo, is you say, okay, I'm going to generate samples from the true probability distribution P, and then use those samples. I'm just going to average together the utilities of the things that I sample from that distribution. And that's a very straightforward strategy that you could follow. It's one that results in an unbiased estimate of the expected utility. But it only has one problem, which is that it can kill you, right? So if you're dealing with a distribution which has a very bad outcome that occurs with very low probability, if you're just taking samples out, with respect to the probability that those events occur in the world, and you're only taking a relatively small number of samples, then there can be a reasonably high probability that you don't sample a very bad low probability outcome. And as a consequence, you don't realize that it's a bad idea to do the thing that you're going to do, right? So, taking the example of Russian roulette, you would have to draw 51 samples from the distribution in order to have a 99.9% chance of discovering that it was a bad idea to play Russian roulette, right? Like that is sampling the bad outcome in that particular situation. And so if you're restricted to consider only a few samples from a distribution, if you have a finite amount of computation that you can use, you're actually better off sampling from a different distribution than the unbiased distribution. So when they run into this kind of problem, the way that statisticians solve it is by using a method that's called importance sampling. And what important sampling is basically an algorithm for sampling from one distribution and then correcting those samples to look like they're from another distribution. And you can choose those distributions in a way that allows you to introduce a bit of bias, but make sure that you're getting samples that allow you to answer the question that you're trying to answer. So if I have some distribution P that I want to sample from, important sampling, you would define another distribution Q that might be one that is easier to generate samples from or has other kinds of properties. And then we'll generate samples from Q. And then we'll assign weights to those samples to correct for the fact that we sampled from the wrong distribution. So instead of averaging the utilities across those samples, giving even weight to each of those samples, we're going to upweight some samples and downweight others. And the way we're going to decide what to upweight is we're going to look at regions where P is greater than Q, and we're going to upweight those. We're going to look at regions where Q is greater than P, and we're going to downweight those. And in fact, when you kind of work out what you're supposed to do in order to assign these weights, the weights are you get by just taking P and dividing it by Q for each of these points. And then we can take that weighted distribution, we've sort of got our corrected distribution, and then we can use that to evaluate our expected utility. So now what we're doing is generating from something that's not actually the distribution with which things occur in the world, and we're weighting those samples in according to the important sampling rule here, and then we're going to use that to estimate what our expected utility would be. So this is you imagining possible outcomes according to some distribution. And now the question is, what distribution should you use if you're not going to use the distribution with which things actually occur in the world? And it turns out that the variance minimizing distribution, the one that reduces the average error in the estimate that you end up producing of the expected utility the most, is the one which we get when we take our distribution to be one which is proportional to P of X, the probability with which things occur in the world, multiplied by a term which is the absolute value of the utility minus the expected utility. So it's a little weird that this has expected utility in it. It's kind of a circular thing. If the expected utility of a decision is actually something that's pretty close to zero, so it's a decision where, you know, you're really could go either way, then the dominating term here is going to be the part which has to do with the utility of that outcome. And so what it says is that you should generate samples from a distribution which multiplies these two things together, the probability with which something occurs in the world and the extremity of its utility, right? Things that are really good will be sampled with higher probability. Things that are really bad will be sampled with higher probability. Things that are kind of boring are not necessarily going to get sampled. And so this sampling procedure says that if you're trying to answer a question about whether you should do something, you should be thinking not necessarily about the frequency with which things occur in the world, but in fact, you should be thinking about things in a way that's biased by how extreme they are. And if you're just making a decision based on a small number of samples, you're going to overrepresent extreme events in making that decision. And so we can use this same kind of model to make predictions about, you know, how probable people are going to rate certain kinds of events. I'm going to sort of skip over this, but we ran an experiment where we asked people to estimate the probability of different kinds of events, which included mundane events, stressful events, and fatal events. And then we could look at the extent to which they overestimated those relative to measures that we had of how probable those things are. And it lines up with this, that the more extreme an event is, the more it's overestimated. And interestingly, this same model actually allows you to then make predictions about decision-making in other contexts. So if you follow the math of that utility weighted sampling procedure, the important sampling procedure all the way through, it says that the way that you should actually go about, you know, making your decision, if you're considering a decision between, say, two alternatives, is you will work out what the utility weighted distribution of possible outcomes is, and then basically tally the number of pros and cons that favor one outcome or another, and then make the decision in favor of the option which actually sort of comes out the best on those. So when you actually sort of go through all the math and calculate what that expected utility formula looks like, it reduces to something which is counting up the number of positive outcomes for one thing and the number of, you know, positive outcomes for the other thing, and then making the decision in the direction which is favored by those tallies. So it actually derives a very simple heuristic for making decisions, and that simple heuristic reproduces a lot of classic phenomena in the study of human decision making. And if you're curious about this, I'm happy to talk more about it in the questions. Okay, so the point of that first part of the talk was really to hopefully make you more comfortable with the idea that even though we're used to thinking about human decision making as something that's kind of flawed and error prone and maybe a little embarrassing, a lot of the things that we do when we're making decisions, including some of these classic kinds of heuristics, are things that correspond to effective solutions to the problem which is posed by trying to make decisions and do complicated probabilistic computations with finite computational resources. And I don't think that's a view that's necessarily inconsistent with the view that, say, Kahneman and Tversky had when they first discovered these kinds of heuristics and the associated biases. What I'm going to do in the second part of the talk is now engage with another problem, which is, given this way of thinking about what rational cognitive processes might be like, how can we derive what good cognitive processes are? And so this is kind of an opportunity to use this framework as a means of basically generating new kinds of cognitive theories, right? Not just evaluating the kinds of theories that have been discovered in the past, but coming up with new predictions about human behavior in terms of the kinds of strategies that humans might follow. And the key insight is that when we've described rational action in these terms, where what we're doing, again, is maximizing over strategies, this trade-off between the expected utility of an action using the beliefs that are derived from a set of computations with the cost of executing those computations, what we end up with is a new kind of decision problem. It's a decision problem which is basically kind of like one level of abstraction up, right? We've sort of made, there's a reason why it's called meta-level rationality, which is that we've moved up to this meta level of now what we're trying to do is make good decisions about the computations that we're going to perform. And so this problem of kind of coming up with a strategy is a sequential decision problem. It's a problem where we might think a little bit, and then we have to decide what's the next bit of thinking we're going to do. And then we have to decide based on the results of that, what's the next bit of thinking that we want to do. And so this sequential decision problem is a sequential decision problem where the computations that we're performing are the actions that we're taking. We're sort of taking actions inside our head that are giving us the information that we're going to need to take actions in the external world. And so expressing things in those terms actually means that we can use some relatively familiar machinery for solving that problem. This is something that we can express as what's called a Markov decision process. So Markov decision processes are a formalism which is used for describing how it is that people and artificial intelligence systems should make a sequence of decisions when trying to, do something like navigate a room or come up with a strategy for playing a game. And they deal exactly with a circumstance where you have a sequence of states of the world and you're trying to select what the best action is based on the information that's provided by your previous actions. What's special about this is there's something called a meta-level Markov decision process, because again, what we're doing is we're making the sequence of decisions at this meta level of the computations that we perform. But having expressed this in terms of a Markov decision process, we can actually use a lot of standard tools that come from AI research with some modifications. That was what that asterisk means, and you can ask me about that later if you're curious, to be able to solve these Markov decision processes and hence derive what end up being optimal cognitive strategies. So just to make this a little more concrete, what a meta-level Markov decision process is basically a way of characterizing the sequence of belief states that we're going to engage in, right? So the idea is that our agents have some beliefs about the world. Based on those beliefs, they're going to choose some computations to perform. Choosing those computations is going to result in new beliefs, but it's also going to result in some computational cost. And then based on those new beliefs, we have to choose some computations to perform. That's going to result in new beliefs, but also computational costs. And we're going to repeat this process until we get to the point where we decide we're done. We're not going to think anymore. This is a special symbol that indicates I am done thinking. And then we're going to take an action in the external world and then receive the reward which is associated with taking that action in the external world. So this is really a kind of theory about, how much to think and what to think about, where we can leverage these AI tools to allow us to derive what the right sequence of computations to perform would be in order to allow us to do a good job of satisfying this criterion in the external world. So I'm going to show you how this works in the context of some classic decision-making and planning problems, which are the problems that we really studied because they're things where the kinds of strategies that people follow are important and where there's an opportunity to potentially discover things about the strategies people use that go beyond the kinds of things that psychologists have previously been able to discover. And the first of these is a multi-alternative risky choice task. So here the setup is you have a bunch of gambles you can choose between. Each of those gambles is associated with a set of outcomes, and the probabilities of those outcomes are known. So that's what's sort of shown on the left-hand side here, where it says balls. It says, okay, there's an urn, and it has 29 balls that have the letter A on them, 39 balls that have the letter B on them, and so on and so on. What you don't know is what the outcomes are, the payoffs are that are associated with those outcomes for each of those gambles. But the way that you can find that out is by clicking on one of these gray cells, and then it tells you, okay, if you choose gamble number 3 and the ball that you pull out of the urn has a letter B on it, then you get $5.67. And so this kind of paradigm has been used as a means of looking at the information that people use when they're trying to make decisions. It forces people to be explicit about the strategy that they're following because they have to click on the cells in order to reveal the information that they're going to use. And this kind of approach has been used to articulate some of the kinds of strategies that people follow when they're making decisions. For example, one classic strategy is called the take the best strategy, where you basically click across a row. So you focus on the row that has the highest probability, you click across that row, and then you find the outcome that has the highest, the gamble that has the highest payoff for that highest probability outcome, and you choose that gamble. So you're sort of taking the best option as indicated by the best single predictor. But the way that psychologists have discovered those kinds of strategies has been relatively heuristic, right? It's been something where what you do is you think hard about the strategies people might follow, you look at the data a bit, and you come up with some ideas about how it is that people might be doing it. And what we can do is actually derive what the optimal strategies are for particular versions of this task, and then compare those against human behavior and potentially learn some new things about what people do. So to put this into this kind of mathematical framework, it's relatively straightforward. Here, your beliefs are about what's behind each of those question marks. The actions that you perform are ones of evaluating a particular cell, so sort of getting back a piece of information about what one of those cells is like. And then the costs are the costs of engaging and clicking. Sometimes those have a monetary cost that's associated with them too. And then at the end, you decide, you choose what gamble you're going to choose, and then you get a payoff from that gamble. And so this takes this problem and then expresses it as this kind of meta-level Markov decision process. So having expressed things in these terms, we can now derive what optimal strategies look like. And it turns out that take the best strategy is actually the optimal solution in what are called non-compensatory low-stakes problems. That is, problems where there's one probability that is much higher than all of the others, in fact, higher than the sum of all of the others. And the stakes are low. So the amount of money that you can get from playing the game is relatively small, right? And so if the stakes are high, then that means you should click more, you should reveal more cells. It's worth thinking harder about it. If the stakes are low, it's not necessarily worth thinking that much. But in this case where you have a single probability that dominates, then this take the best strategy is the thing that is actually the best, most effective rational strategy. And this actually accords with what people do in these circumstances. So the other thing that we can do, though, is discover new strategies. So for example, if you have a compensatory low stakes problem, this is one where now there's still one probability that's higher than the others, but it's not very much higher than the others. Then in fact, in this case, the best strategy combines take the best with satisficing. So what you should do is click along a row until you observe a value that's above some threshold. And then you say, well, that's good enough. And then you take the bet that corresponds to that observed value that was above that threshold. And this is a strategy that hadn't previously been identified, but people do seem to follow in precisely the circumstances that this optimal model identifies. The same kind of approach can give you insight into what on its surface may look like a very different kind of choice problem. This is a problem that's called simple choice or consumer choice, where now we're thinking about somebody who's choosing between, say, a set of different snacks, right? So we've taken away all of the things that you click on and all of this, and now what we're interested in is just what you choose, but also what you choose to look at while you're making that choice. And so this kind of paradigm has been used fairly extensively to study how people make decisions in this kind of simple choice setting. And there's a lot of information we have about how people's eye movements seem to be related to their choices. So in particular, the longer you look at something, the more likely you are to choose it. And the last thing that you look at is likely to be the thing that you end up choosing. And the way that these phenomena have been explained is using relatively mechanistic kinds of models that that use kind of like, if you've heard of drift diffusion models, these are models that assume that you have some kind of accumulation of evidence that goes in one direction or the other. And then they assume that when you're looking at something, that accelerates the rate at which you're accumulating evidence for liking that particular thing. And then that can produce these kinds of phenomena. But in fact, you can explain these results using a formalism which is very much like the formalism that I went through for that, that example of the choosing between the gambles, where we can think about what people are doing here as basically having beliefs about how much they're going to enjoy eating something. And then what they're doing is when they're looking at it, they're thinking about that thing and then generating a sample that comes from that distribution that they're using to update their estimate of what that distribution is like. And so this process of looking at something, gathering information, updating your estimate is exactly the kind of thing that we can express using one of these meta-level Markov decision processes, where here your beliefs are about those, values, your utilities that you would enjoy when you eat something. The costs are the costs of moving your eyes around, and evaluation is now just looking at something and thinking about it and sort of getting that sample from that distribution. And again, expressed in these terms, we can derive what the optimal strategy looks like. And we did this for comparison to a classic experiment in this domain where people are making choices among 3 objects in very much the same way that I just showed you. So what we find is that just out of the mathematical solution to this problem of how you should choose to sample from these different distributions, we get exactly these kinds of classic effects about choice. So how long you look at something is related to the probability that you choose it, because essentially, if you're considering 3 different options, if you get a sample from each one of those, if one of those samples is far below the other 2, then you're going to spend more time looking at those other 2, right? And so this is just something that falls out of the math of the structure of this problem. It's also the case that high-value items are fixated more, essentially for that same reason, that you're going to spend more time sampling something which is potentially going to be the thing that you end up choosing. And that emphasis is increased, particularly as time goes on, which means that we have a way of understanding why it is that often you end up choosing the things that you're looking at the end of your decision process, because those are likely to be the things that have the highest subjective value. The third example I'm going to go through quickly is really related to the example that I used to motivate this sort of notion that people are sort of inspiring and interesting in the kinds of strategies that they engage with as a consequence of the cognitive limitations that they suffer under. Here what Kasparov is engaging in is a process of planning. And what he's doing is showing that he's doing a really good job of prioritizing which particular trajectories he's thinking about when he's trying to decide how to pursue the rest of his game of chess. So we aren't able to, at this point, analyze something as complex as a game of chess. We instead analyze something far simpler, which is the web of cache, as it's called in the lab, which is a very simple planning game where you have to navigate this spider to one of the endpoints here. So you have to go make a sequence of 3 choices. And then the spider is going to get a number of points that correspond to the points that are passed over following that trajectory. And then when we run this as an experiment, you get paid an amount which corresponds to the number of points that the spider accumulates. The catch is that, like in that mouse lab study that I showed you, where you had to click to reveal the payoffs, we put people in this paradigm where they don't actually know the payoffs that are associated with the different nodes in this graph. And so now what they have to do is figure out which pieces of information they're going to gather in order to determine what the best path might be. And we can look at the choices that they make and then the point at which they switch from gathering information to deciding which path to follow. So again, we can express this as a meta-level Markov decision process. So here, the beliefs that you have are about the values that are hidden behind each of those gray circles. The actions that you're going to take are the ones that are revealing some of that information. And the computational costs are involved in clicking and sort of integrating those pieces of information. And you get a payoff at the end, which corresponds to whatever the path is that you end up choosing. So we can derive what the optimal strategy looks like And on some simple metrics of how well we're fitting behavior, it actually does better than a lot of the classic algorithms that computer scientists have proposed for solving these kinds of search problems. So it demonstrates a kind of adaptivity that isn't a characteristic of these algorithms. And one way that you can see this is by looking at how people decide when to stop searching. That is, when they're ready to click somewhere and make a decision. So what this plot is showing by color is the probability with which people terminate their search. That is, the probability with which people say, I'm done investigating, gathering information about these nodes, I'm just going to choose the path that I'm going to follow. And then that's displayed as a function of two things. The best expected path value discovered so far, that's what the vertical axis shows, and then the number of clicks that they've made so far, and that's what the horizontal axis shows. And so if you look at this plot, what you should be able to see is that as you go diagonally from the bottom left corner to the top right corner, there's a change in color where you have dark colors in the bottom left corner going up to the bright yellow colors in the top right corner. And what that illustrates is that basically people are adaptively making this decision about whether they're done searching. So they're trading off how good is the best solution I've found so far with how much work have I done in order to discover that solution, and how much more work could I potentially do, and essentially evaluating what are the potential gains from thinking about this further. And so this kind of adaptivity is something that optimal strategy shows. It's explicit in the way that we formulate this as a meta-level Markov decision process, that you're making this trade-off between getting a good outcome and having to think hard about what those outcomes look like. But it's not a property of these generic algorithms that are used in computer science, like best first search, that they're able to make those kinds of trade-offs. Instead, they focus on finding the best outcome regardless of the associated computational costs. So across these different examples, I think there are sort of three high-level conclusions that I want to hopefully convince you of today. So the first is that resource rational analysis gives us a way to bridge the gap between rationality and heuristics. So I showed you in the first part of the talk that a lot of the classic kinds of heuristic behavior that people engage in when they're making decisions are things that we can understand as the rational use of limited computational resources. The second is more of a nuanced point, and this is something that I sort of mention in part to head off concerns expressed in the question period, which is that in saying that, I'm not arguing that people are rational in any way. I think that's not a good way of making progress in understanding human cognition. Rather, I'm offering this as a framework that we can use for modeling human behavior. So the way that I think about this is that we made a lot of progress in understanding human cognition by making rational models because they tell us, under a particular characterization of the computational problem that people are solving, what the ideal solution to that computational problem looks like. And those ideal solutions are things that are informative and helpful for understanding, human cognition, because we can look at how do people deviate from those rational solutions. That gives us clues about the kinds of algorithms or mechanisms that might be involved in solving a problem. And because they tell us kind of like what the upper limits of behavior are under that construal of the problem being solved. And they can also tell us when we're wrong about the problem that we think people are solving, and help us to discover that in fact people are doing something that's quite different from the thing that we think that they should be doing. Resource rational analysis takes that same approach, but not, rather than focusing on this kind of behaviorist notion of rational action, where we're focusing on the external actions that people take, now we have a framework that we can use for making sense of our internal cognitive processes. And so it gives us a criterion that we can use for, in the same way, deriving what optimal cognitive processes might look like. And then we are able to compare those back against human cognition. One of the reasons why this is important is that some of the things that we want to understand as cognitive psychologists are not things that are about external behavior. So for example, when we think about problems like problem solving, that's something where the definition of the computational problem is trivial. You want to find the solution. What we're interested in is not what the solution is. We're interested in how people get there, right? It's not about the destination, it's about the journey. We're interested in the cognitive processes, the strategies, the algorithms, the heuristics that people follow. And whenever we're trying to understand those kinds of internal processes rather than external actions, this framework of resource rationality gives us a tool that I think is equally powerful to that more classical approach to thinking about rational action for understanding human cognition. And I really see this as an opportunity to revisit some of the classic ideas in cognitive psychology, things like problem solving, planning, decision making, where we have for a while had ideas about what those cognitive processes look like, but not necessarily had a rational standard against which to compare them to give us predictions that we could then go on and evaluate and get further insights. So thank you very much. I should say this was, joint work with Falk Leader, along with a bunch of other people who are involved in these specific projects. And then Fred Calloway was involved in, I think, all of the examples that I showed at the end in terms of these strategies for, these methods for deriving these optimal strategies. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Tom. You can just imagine us, I don't know, like that awkward DNC thing where like everyone just applauding in their own respective rooms, because obviously can't show you that. So everybody, we're going to now enter the question period. We'll be doing it for about 30 minutes. And again, you can either post questions into the Q&A bar that you should see at the bottom, or alternatively, you can raise your hand in the participants view, and then I will go ahead and moderate and allow you to come online with your audio to actually ask the question. Maybe while people either type or warm up on the interface or anything like that. And by the way, if any of you have questions about the interface, feel free to post them in the chat. Maybe I'll ask a question, Tom. So, the thing that keeps being on my mind, and all the way back from the initial things you were discussing when anchoring an adjustment, is that you've done a really wonderful job of sort of explicating some potential algorithms, how we can maybe think a little bit about the cost and consequences of them. But it seems to me that the other part that seems necessary for a lot of this to work is to know a lot more about the actual sampling distributions from which all this is coming from, right? And so I'm thinking, for example, specifically in situations where the agent trying to make the decision, maybe for various reasons, is different from the rest of the community in the nature of their sort of like implicit distribution. So maybe a very clear example would be something like children who've not had the opportunity as much to acquire some of these, as robust distributions from which they're supposed to be sampling. So I'm curious both to hear from you a little bit about how you think the nature of the actual sampling distributions might impact all of this, and what kinds of differences we might expect between agents who have more or less stable, or where there might be certain domains where those sampling distributions might be quite different between individuals.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, the first thing that I'd say is that I think this framework is something that might be particularly useful for developmental psychology, or more broadly for thinking about individual differences, because the classic Bayesian model has essentially like 2 degrees of freedom, right? It has like, what's the prior distribution you assume, and then the mechanism of change is just data, right? So if you want to give a Bayesian account of cognitive development, and people have done this, the account that you're giving is essentially one which is saying that data comes in and beliefs change, and then that's the mechanism by which development occurs. What's different about the way that I've been talking about things here is that it gives you this, extra degree of freedom or dimension that you can imagine changes happening along, which is the assumptions that we make about what the computations are that are available to agents. And so that means that you can think that there's a real developmental shift that happens at a certain point, not as a consequence of the data that you're seeing, but as a consequence of the kinds of computations that come online and become available to you when you're trying to solve that problem. I think it's a little more like Piagetian or something like that, in terms of the idea that you might have different kinds of operations that you're able to perform as a consequence of the process of development. And again, you can think about that in very interesting ways in terms of how your cognitive operations are changed as a consequence of data and as a consequence of the other kinds of representational structures that you're developing. And I think it opens up all sorts of interesting passages there. So I think that's the way that I would focus on that. So some of these things are things where you're going to get a kind of quantitative variation like, when I talked about anchoring and adjustment, right, I said, one of the things that's relevant there is like how much certainty you have about a particular quantity, and that's going to influence how long you should think about it. And you could use those kinds of things to make predictions about like, how long kids would think about something versus how long adults would think about it or something else. But I think where I see the opportunity is thinking about some of those more qualitative kinds of changes in the, the computational architecture that might be involved for different kinds of agents.
Great, thanks. I'll ask a very quick follow-up, and then other questions are coming in, and so I'll call on them. Do you? I mean, I'm surprised by the answer, because I would have, my default stance would have been that these are probably quantitative differences more so than qualitative ones. So I think that's a very exciting answer in that regard. Do you also? I mean, besides the kinds of things that you spoke about, do you think that we should also maybe have a default assumption that the costs for children are also higher? Like, is it that you feel that there's a case that, like, whether because the brain is underdeveloped, or whether because, if we cash out some of these costs because of lack of practice or something like that, or maybe because some of these, procedures that they have are maybe somehow actually just more costly.
Yeah.
Like, should we also expect some differences in development as a result of that?
So, I mean, I think it's a complex picture, because there's a lot of work going on right now where people are trying to quantify what cognitive cost means, and you can think about those things varying, right? But some of the costs that we have as adults are costs of overriding automated systems, right? So my favorite example of this is I have a 6-year-old. I can give her a book upside down, and she can read it basically as well as she can read it the right way up, because she's still at the point of like puzzling out words, and it doesn't really matter if it's upside down or the right way up in terms of solving it in that way. Whereas if you give an adult a book upside down, it's going to take them relatively longer to be able to read the words than if you give it to them right way up, because they've automated that process of reading things the right way up, and they've got like larger units that they're using for doing that. So I think there are going to be trade-offs. Like you're going to find that again, you get these sort of paradoxical predictions that we get with the basic Bayesian models. So I did a bunch of work with Alison Gopnik where we showed that there are things that kids do better than adults as a consequence of kind of having flatter prior distributions. And I'd expect the same kind of thing, that if you have adults having to override sort of, very automated kinds of processes, they're going to end up doing a less good job of finding the right strategies than kids who have much more freedom in doing that.
Awesome, thanks so much. So I'm going to start with the people holding up their hand, and then I'm going to move over to the Q&A panel. So Kristen, I'm going to give you, you now have the permission to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Okay, I think I did unmute myself. So I was struck by what you said about how you're not saying that people are rational, and so I've just been thinking about that a little bit. And one of the things that, one of the thoughts that brought me to is that in the tasks that you're using to model these things, a lot of the time the costs are in the same units as the benefits, the thing that we're trying to get, right? Like it's costing me points to look at the different possibilities, and then it's a number of points that I'm trying to maximize on. And that seems a lot more like, that's really different than I think my understanding of what people would be doing just when they're thinking about problems in the real world, right? Because the costs are sort of this cognitive, maybe boredom, right? Like there's all kinds of factors going in there, but then the benefits that they're trying to drive are completely different. So I first was thinking of that in terms of, well, maybe that's where there's room for irrationality, right? Because I can just put a subjectively really huge weight on the boredom factor. Yep. But I guess more broadly, it made me wonder, like, how do you think that works? Like, how do you think people determine the exchange rates between, right? Like, how much more boring is it going to be if I keep checking versus how many, what better solution I could come up with with this problem.
Yeah.
For this problem.
No, I think that's a great question. So it's true that in all of our tasks we have these in the same units, and we did that deliberately, as you may have noticed.
Sure, yeah.
But in subsequent work, we have tried some other things, and one of the interesting things that we've discovered is that so one of the things that we're interested in beyond this, in particular, Falk is interested in this question, is how is it that people actually end up with these strategies, right? So there are two ways that you could think about this. One is, you know, you have good strategies because you sort of look at the problem and you analyze it, and then you sort of abstract away, okay, like this is clearly the thing that I should be doing in this circumstance. The other is that you learn those strategies essentially through reinforcement learning, but it's reinforcement learning not on your external actions, but on your internal actions. So this is, we call this metacognitive reinforcement learning. We have pretty good evidence that people do the latter, that people engage in, you know, sort of these, you know, you can think about this as kind of like a model-based versus model-free distinction in the reinforcement learning literature. People do something like this kind of model-free metacognitive reinforcement learning, but points are not effective for engaging that process. You need to give them much more visceral costs, and the most visceral cost for somebody online is time. So the places where we've really found people being responsive to cost are not when we've gone from, you know, 1 cent to 2 cents to 3 cents, but when we've gone from waiting 1 second versus 2 seconds versus 3 seconds. And that seems to be the kind of thing that people seem most sensitive to when they're making these trade-offs.
Yeah, it's still like, and this is far beyond like the scope of what you're talking about, but it's still, I'm still so curious, like, how do people convert the cost of waiting for 3 seconds against the value of getting like 2 hamburgers instead of 1 hamburger?
Yeah. So there have been, there's some nice experiments. My colleague Nathaniel Dorr has done some of these experiments. Wouter Cools has done some of these experiments, but where people have been looking at quantifying the value of effort, which is not quite the same thing, right? It's not like wait 3 seconds versus a hamburger. It's the way that they do this is they set it up so that people have choices between doing different tasks. So you do a task for a bit, and then you do another task for a bit, and then you're like, okay, do you want like $2 to do the first task or $3 to do the second task? And then you can set up gambles where you're like, okay, if you have a 50% chance of ending up with the first task versus a 30% chance of ending up with the second task, or you do nothing. And you can sort of do all of the standard kind of like economics utility estimation tricks for doing this. And so you can use that to read off these exchange rates, right? So would you prefer to do task number 1 and wait for 3 seconds, or task number 2 and, you know, not have to wait at all, right? And so you can use those as tools for trying to titrate those kinds of quantities.
Yeah. Okay, I'll let someone else go because I think this is super interesting. I could talk about it forever, but I'll pass the mic.
Thank you, Kristen. So we have a number of questions in the Q&A panel, so I'm just going to read them out from the top. And for those of you interested, you can vote on these questions to sort of reorder them. So the first one's from Noah Silverberg, who asks, does fatigue influence people to stop exerting mental effort and settle on a decision sooner? I'm wondering about applications to understanding and preventing medical errors, e.g. medical residents accidentally prescribing a dangerously high dose 14 hours into an overnight shift.
Yes, I believe in the anchoring and adjustment case, people have looked at factors like that, and you do see less adjustment, so a greater influence of initial anchors, and so that means objectively worse estimates under those. Like, I know the ones that they've manipulated, as I mentioned, are things like cognitive load, but my guess is that would also hold for fatigue.
Great, thank you. Catherine, I see you. I'm going to do one more questions from the Q&A panel, and then I'll switch over to you. So the next question from Andy Barron, how are the models described influenced by factors that we think also impact decision-making / choice, such as motivation, mood, affect, and situational factors like presence of others? So thinking about conformity, the Ash experiments, and things like that.
Those are great questions. They're currently outside the mathematical framework. The things that I would think about there, we've done a little bit of work engaging with some of these things, not in the context of the sort of resource rationality framework that I'm talking about here, but in the broader, like, one way that you can think about this enterprise more broadly is saying, if you come to me with a proposal about how you think the brain's cognitive architecture works, or the mind's cognitive architecture works, then I will tell you what is a good way of using those pieces of computational machinery for solving problems. And so you can think about some kinds of emotion in service of, those kinds of questions. And so one example of that, which is joint work with Paul Kruger, who's mentioned here on this slide, we have I don't know if it's, maybe it's slightly wacky, but we have a paper where we look at, if you imagine, so this again relates to the reinforcement learning literature. So there are two ways of solving a reinforcement learning problem, what's called model-based and model-free. In fact, there's more ways than that, and AI people use more ways than that, but psychologists and neuroscientists are focused on two ways. So the two ways are model-based and model-free. So the model-based solution is basically, you take all of the information you have about the problem, and then you derive what the optimal strategy is. So you're building a model of the world, you're estimating the probabilities that are associated with particular actions, and you've got a whole model of the rewards, the transition probabilities, all of these things, and you solve that model, and then that's the thing that you're using for guiding your action. You can kind of think about that as sort of deliberative planning. And then model-free is, you are just learning, in this particular state of the world, what's the best action for me to take. And you can kind of, one reason why psychologists like this is that it's, this distinction between deliberative planning versus instinct-driven action, right? The sort of reflexive model-free strategy versus the thoughtful model-based strategy. And again, my colleague Nathaniel Dorr has done a lot of work on this kinds of paradigms. So we asked the question, well, what if you think of human minds as having access to both of those things, but you have a constraint, which is that the model-free system is always the one that decides what you end up doing. So you have a deliberative system, but you also have this reflexive, instinctive system, and it's the low-level system that's actually the one that drives behavior. But you have one kind of pathway for communication between those systems, which is that the model-based system is able to influence the rewards that are experienced by the model-free system. So the way that the model-based system communicates with the model-free system is by modulating the rewards that are experienced by the model-free system. And then you can ask, what's the optimal way of modulating those rewards? And so the answer that you get is that the model-based system should basically add the value that it associates, this kind of long-term value, to the reward function that the model-free system is using. And it's the difference in value between the state that you were previously in and the state that you moved to is the thing that you should end up adding to the reward function. And if you do that, then it means that the model-free system can learn much more quickly. But if you ask, what do those things correspond to? What are those quantities? What those quantities are is basically something that you could use for understanding, things like regret or remorse, or there's a whole set of human emotions where we feel bad after we do something, and if you think about that objectively, there's no reason why we should feel bad. That's just decreasing our utility. Why are we doing that? But one way of answering that is that it's a mechanism that we're using for decreasing our immediate reward in a way that's helping us to learn that we shouldn't do that again. And I think there are going to be aspects of those kinds of emotional responses that we can make sense of as part of the mechanisms by which all of the pieces that make us up manage to communicate with us in the same kind of way that this kind of optimization framework lays out.
Great, Catherine. I'm gonna give you the allow to talk, so you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question.
Hi, I'm amazed. Wonderful talk. I'm glad that I've got some time to talk about model-based, model-free stuff with you after this, because I've just got so many questions. But one of the thoughts I had was, if we can show that non-human animals have some of the same decision-making biases as humans, does this have any impact on the way in which you look at cognitive resources? Because obviously, lesser vertebrate animals should have far fewer cognitive resources at hand. So if their decision making looks like ours, does that tell us anything useful?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting dimension. This is actually something I've been thinking about a lot. So I wrote a paper that's going to come out in Ticks soon, which is called Understanding Human Intelligence via Human Limitations. And basically the argument there is that, if we build even as artificial intelligence systems become smarter and better, we shouldn't expect them to become smarter and better in ways that make them more like humans, because humans face a particular set of computational problems. We have finite computational resources, we have finite time, and we have like limited capacity for being able to communicate with one another. And it's solving that particular configuration of problems that then creates what looks like human intelligence. And so I was excited about this idea, sent it off and so on. But then, like I started talking to some other people who think about other species and things like that. And I realized that, there's another whole problem, which is how can you differentiate the computational problems that human minds have to solve from the computational problems that animal minds have to solve? And so, yeah, there might be some quantitative gradation in terms of those constraints of time and computation, and there's definitely qualitative differences in the sort of bandwidth for communication. But those are exactly the kinds of questions that I'm now like trying to grapple with and thinking about, like, what does that mean for the differences that we'd expect to see across species, and can you use that same kind of framework for deriving the different kinds of intelligent behavior that you might expect to see as a consequence of facing different kinds of profile of constraint?
Cool, thanks so much. I have more questions, but I'll hand over the conch as well, so I don't hog it.
Thanks. We got a couple more questions from the Q&A section. So Patrick asks, yes, thank you. Might you frame conscientiousness as cognitive resource allocation strategy, i.e. less weighing on time/effort cost?
Can he unmute and say a little more about what he means?
Patrick, would you like to do that? If you'd like to raise your hand, and I'm happy to let you do that. Oh, here, perfect. You can go ahead, Patrick. You just have to unmute yourself.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, so conscientiousness is an individual difference where people can persist longer on tasks and so forth. And I'm wondering if perhaps in any of your research, you've looked at that individual difference in terms of how that affects strategies, because conscientious persons might not weight, time and effort things the same way.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the way that I would think about that, right? So one way of thinking about that is that your experienced cost is different. And I think, yeah, I have, two daughters, and they're very different along this dimension, where for one of them, every moment is experienced, extremely in terms of having to wait for something, and the other one's happy to like think in her own head about things. But yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, where you could quantify that in terms of differences in experienced cost.
Have you used that in your data at all to help improve your models?
So all of the work that I presented is looking at aggregate behavior, but I think thinking exactly about, I mean, this relates to what I was talking about with Darko as well, that I think this kind of the extra capacity that you get here for accommodating individual differences is, I think, one of the bonuses that comes from this kind of framework, and I think definitely worth thinking about.
Thank you.
And then Patrick, while you're online, do you want to ask your other question? It's at the top of the Q&A pile anyway, so if you'd like to ask it, you can go ahead, or I'm happy to just read it out.
Great. Well, it's just taking that a little bit further and looking at overconfidence as a kind of individual difference that is costly in terms of decision making. Particularly, I know in performance, if someone's overconfident, they can think they've got the right answer when they don't. How would you would you frame overconfidence as perhaps a kind of an important sampling of ego defense, that one is looking at that as an important variable more than other people might?
Yeah, so I have a student, Rachel Jansen, who has a paper that's under review where we actually do some modeling of overconfidence, in particular looking at Dunning-Kruger effect. And so what we actually do in that paper is we show that there's the basic description of the Dunning-Kruger effect is consistent with a kind of Bayesian inference, right? Where what you should do is, so if you're trying to estimate how well you did on something, you should correct that towards the mean of your prior distribution. And so that means you would be underconfident. If you did well, you would be underconfident, and if you did poorly, you would be overconfident. Although we actually show that we did a massive experiment with like 4,000 people and show that there's an additional factor on top of that. So the interpretation of the Dunning-Kruger effect in terms of people also being, there being a relationship between how sensitive people are to errors and their ability. There's independent systematic evidence for that in the data. So it's not just that sort of statistical story. But that's kind of the way that I think about a lot of these overconfidence phenomena, is that you can certainly have rational quantities of overconfidence without even having to involve the ego, when you're sort of appropriately, doing what Bayesians call shrinkage, which is, moving your estimate in the direction of, what your expectation is, in a way that's very similar to the kinds of phenomena that showed up in the anchoring adjustment.
Right, I'd like to see that paper you mentioned. Jensen?
Jensen, yeah. If you send me an email, I can send you a copy.
Thanks. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Patrick. Just, everybody, we're gonna do just a couple of more questions. We're gonna try and end at about 1:55 to give Tom a 5-minute break before his slew of meeting begins. So I'll switch back to the Q&A. Edwina asks, do deficits in metacognition lead to more irrational decisions or ones with less utility? Is utility judged or assessed by metacognition?
So people mean a lot of different things when they talk about metacognition. So I think in psychology, metacognition has largely been studied in context of like memory, whether like how aware you are of your ability to retrieve information, or some of these sort of education-oriented settings where it's like how aware of you are you about your performance levels. So I think the kind of way that we're framing metacognition here, right, is maybe expanding that envelope a little bit to include these phenomena like metacognitive reinforcement learning, which are really about learning which computations you can perform are effective. And so we would expect that if you had a deficit in the ability to do that kind of learning, in order to be able to recognize what are good kinds of cognitive actions to take when you're solving a problem, that would mean that you'd be less likely to end up with adaptive strategies. And maybe that's a way of answering that question.
Great. Next question from Nicholas. How do you account for humans' adaptation or ability to learn to make different decisions? For example, a novel chess player and a grandmaster both have much different decision-making processes for their bounded rationality.
Yeah, so I think, again, this comes down to this kind of phenomenon of metacognitive reinforcement learning. And again, you can connect it back to one of the things that I really like about this approach is that there's been a huge amount of research on like what I'd call object level reinforcement learning, that is reinforcement learning at a level of external actions in the world. And you can leverage all of that research on brain mechanisms and different strategies that people can follow, and then apply it at this metacognitive level to have theories that answer exactly this kind of question of how it is that people end up learning effective strategies. One of the things that Falk in particular has been working on, and I encourage you to check out his website, he has lots of papers that are about this, is how can you facilitate metacognitive reinforcement learning? So we developed some tools when he was working with me for facilitating people solving sequential decision-making problems, where we use a trick which allows us to give people the equivalent of extra computational capacity by putting that computation in the world. It's actually the same trick that's involved in that thing I was talking about your model-based system communicating with your model-free system. It's changing the reward function that people experience by using a computer to sort of generate additional, to incentivize taking certain kinds of actions. And we call it optimal gamification. And so he's looked at using that same kind of gamification framework in the context of metacognitive reinforcement learning. And so what that does is give you a tool for, for thinking about how you could do things like, learn to play chess better. And he's actually looked at scenarios that are kind of similar to that. So the particular variation that we've looked at is like showing that if you give people feedback on their metacognitive performance, that is, they thought too much, they thought too little, which we can read off from the actions that they take at the object level, then we can improve their metacognitive performance in a way that generalizes to other problems.
All right, and I know that there's still some leftover questions, but again, I want to be very mindful and give Tom just a chance to relax before the meetings begin. So everybody, join me one more time in whatever way you can, thanking Tom for a really terrific talk and Q&A period as well. And yeah, we'll call it a day there. Bonnie might send out a survey to all the attendees, just asking, you know, what in the session worked well, what didn't, so we can also adjust in the future as well. But with that in mind, we're gonna end the Zoom call in just a little bit. Thank you all for joining us. Yeah, have a wonderful rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you.